I grew up as a peasant boy. I went to university and discovered the beauty of thinking about thinking. And thinking about thinking simply means that you make your own thinking, the way that you think, the way that your associations travel, the object of your own reflections in order to ask, oh, why do I think the way I think? Why do I come to judge the way I judge? Could I change this? Where do the ideas that I operate with come from? Are they actually mine? Do I want them to be mine? How else would I behave?
I'm Randror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Dr. Tobias Rees. Tobias is CEO of Transformations of the Human School and was formerly the William Dawson Chair at McGill University and the Reid Hoffman Professor of Humanities at the Parsons School of Design. He's a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and holds degrees in philosophy, anthropology, and neurobiology. In the early 2010s, he recognized that contemporary technology not only disrupts our historical established ways of thinking and doing, but also creates new ones, radically new possibilities that unfold beyond what we take for granted. This, he believes, is not only a sweeping event in the history of thought, but also a major opportunity. Technology itself has become philosophical, and it has become possible to do philosophy by building and inventing new technologies. This led him on a path to building a new institution dedicated to the interplay of philosophy, art, science, and engineering, and to the way they blur the lines between the human and non-human. We spoke at the end of May 2022, and I was looking forward to speaking to Tobias because he's been doing some of the most fascinating work bringing together practical machine learning engineering, art, and philosophy to rethink our conception of what's possible to us as humans and our place in the world. Talking to Tobias revealed his unique mind at work. I think Tobias is uniquely attuned to the impact that concepts and the lack of them has on our ability to make sense of the world, and also the ways our concepts limit us if we hold them too rigidly. We talked about growing up with no books and few words in a small peasant village in southern Germany. The importance and uses of silence, which stayed with him ever since. How he became interested in philosophy and the big questions after his grandfather's death. Moving freely from philosophy to comparative religion to anthropology and art history. The happy accident that led him to study neurobiology and learning to see himself as a brain. The importance of concepts in framing our day-to-day experience. What do terms like human and humanity mean? When were they introduced? How did they evolve? What is the relationship between nature, humans, and machines? His work with some of the largest technology companies who are building a future to bring philosophy and art into the room. Where does creativity lie with AI algorithms like DALL-E 2, and the need to always re-examine our assumptions about the world and our values? I love the way Tobias described the role of the artist or the designer as the go-between between the philosopher and the scientist and engineer. Many of the designers I know live in this in-between space, a space that is becoming more crucial as the gap between the human and the machine continues to shrink. I also loved thinking through the radical implications of the increasingly blurred lines between man, nature, and machine. This conversation with Tobias is one of many weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, authors, makers, activists, and leaders who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now, let's jump right in with Dr. Tobias Rees. All right. I am sitting here with Dr. Tobias Rees. Tobias, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron.
And so when the podcast started during COVID times, so we used to start by asking, what's your COVID experience? And today the world has moved on, but I realized I still like to ask a similar question, which is, what's it like to be you in the world today?
Good question. I guess COVID's, happened to coincide with launching transformations of the human. And so at first we were remote, but now we're all in office. The school happens in person every day, face to face. So it feels like a good moment in time where the gift of face-to-face conversations with people who ask similar, related, extended questions to the ones that drive me, animate me, get me up in the morning. Yeah, feels good, feels like a gift. There's an appreciation that I would probably not have had to such a degree before.
It's a really interesting time to launch a school during COVID. And so I'm guessing you started with remote and then transitioned gradually into classes. What was that experience like?
So school was never remote. We had the first day of class on December 1st, 2021. And we welcomed everybody on a Thursday and went on a big outing, a hike on Friday, and have been in person in school throughout. We do rigorous testing. We have masks on even now, and it worked well.
Beautiful. So as we go into this conversation, I like to ask this question, which our listeners already kind of know to expect, which helps us tie the person with whatever it is they're doing. And so my question to you is, what's something you learned in childhood that still drives you today or still guides you today?
It's not an easy question, and I explain why. I have an answer, but I must meander to give the answer. So I grew up in a very, very small peasant village in Swabia, in southern Germany. And I grew up mostly with my grandparents. So not only am I an only child, I'm an only grandchild. Parents were working, and I grew up, on the farm. Most of my older relatives were illiterate. And we lived with the seasons. It sounds romantic, but let me be clear that this was a very tough life. Like when you only eat what you produce, seasons have a very different meaning. We chopped the wood, with which we heated the house. We slaughtered. We worked on the fields. Sat on an old 1948 tractor and drove into the forest because my grandparents knew where berries grow, and we made shoes. And however, there was a lot of free time for a little boy, and I used to climb up an elderflower tree that led me to a lower part of the roof, and I literally spent hours on end there. So we had no books, none. People usually say, well, you had the Bible. I'm like, no, wow. We had no books. And I was just sitting there and laying around and looking at the clouds and looking at the different parts of the trees, and I have no vocabulary to express what happened there, largely because it was not a verbal process, but that withdrawing into something where ideas come and go and come again and grow. That is something that I do to this day. So one of the things that I learned is you grow up in a somewhat literate peasant society with no books. That doesn't mean it's not an intellectual space, so there is no space for ideas or the mind, but it assumes particular forms. So that stayed with me. Moments where I don't know exactly what I'm thinking or doing, but that are systematically, like I make a lot of time available for this in my day, because that's where my ideas come, and that's where I regenerate, I guess.
Yeah. As someone with a Buddhist background, that sounds very much like the state we're trying to get in meditation, where without verbal thinking and without necessarily knowing what you did with the time, except just, sitting.
Yeah. I thought a lot about this because, I studied anthropology, and like when I grew up, you just didn't talk. If you talked, unless it was necessary, it was considered, failure of character, kind of. So we would work, like my dad and I would work side by side in the forest for days on end. And I don't think we ever exchanged a word. And when I later studied anthropology, the importance of silence in many peasant societies and hunter and gatherer societies, where you literally walk and walk and walk for days, and conversation is reduced to a bare minimum. It's a really interesting separation of a thought space from a verbal space, because lots goes on. You communicate in many ways, but this like capacity to withdraw from a verbal space or a space where thought is already prefigured in terms of words is an interesting experience.
Just to dive in a little bit into that, so do you think silence serves a purpose? Do you think it's being protected for some sort of reason that you can intuit?
Well, in a peasant village, I often felt that talking is a distraction. It leads you away from the focus that you're supposed to have. And I sometimes felt that there's a moral judgment linked to it, and that is people who have the necessity to talk often attend to their inner states, and you cannot afford that because life's hard. So you don't want to attend to inner states. This goes along with comments like you're a kid and you say, "Oh, this hurts," and everyone will say, "Okay, just focus on what you're doing. Don't pay too much attention to yourself." When you get a little older, you get like, "Okay, it hurts. Yeah, sure. Everybody has something that hurts. You think you're something special. Just keep on focusing." It can be a tool. It can be sad, but it can be a tool. Silence is neutral. It can play powerful roles, and it can be boring. It is. I think it depends very much on the situation in which one is silent. But yeah. I value it. I say it depends because, as you know, in many, for example, in Buddhist rituals, silence can play a highly important role. And in concerts, in music concerts, silence can play a role. In thought processes, you just don't want someone to talk to you while you're sort of wherever thinking happens. And yet you can be sitting in a room and suffer from the silence that this big empty room gives to you. So it can be good, it can be neutral, it can be used to highly effective ends. And I assume that we all do use it systematically in our everyday lives, sometimes more explicit, sometimes less explicit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And ever since I started meditating, I've been paying attention to this quality and the types of things that I can do with noise and the types of things that I cannot do with noise or even with music. I can't write with anything but white noise. But I can design and listen to a podcast, no problem. It's just different parts of the brain.
It's interesting. I think, there is, it's not that I cannot, so it has happened that I did write with music on, but it's almost always like one song that runs on endless loop. So then I'm kind of in that song, and that's where I'm writing from. But by and large, I prefer silence, and unless I decide now I want to listen to music, but then I do nothing but listen to music for the next hour or so, or for the next 10 minutes. That can also be. But even then, I tend to obsessively listen to the same song over and over again.
So you've been called a Renaissance man, and you're definitely a multidisciplinary person, and you studied so many different things. So we have on the list neuroscience, art history, philosophy of science, anthropology, I'm sure among many others. Tell me about this journey of how you started getting interested in all of these things. What was the sequence, and what was the reasoning?
This was all by accident and not by design. Depends on how idiosyncratic, what you can say personal and then it sounds deep. It can sound idiosyncratic and then it's just the random contingencies of a life. And I usually prefer I think there is an art to being superficial. It's an accomplishment to not take yourself very serious and believe in depth. But when I was in just around 20, And I mentioned before, I grew up with my grandparents. My grandfather died, and that was unexpected. And so when something like that just happens, I think it's very typical for children between 17, 22, 23, that their grandparents die or one of their grandparents dies, and that the world loses its givenness to some degree. So I was really troubled by questions that I had no answers for and still have none. But back then I suffered from that. Right now, at this stage of life, I feel it liberating that there are no answers. But back then, I could not understand how everybody could take anything for granted, from why are we here to who decided that grass is green? Why did they say green? Why did they not say yellow? And studied philosophy, anthropology, and comparative history of religion, driven by, naive, retrospectively like ideas. How do people elsewhere think about the world? How do they handle this? This was my only impulse to study anthropology. Comparative history of religion was very much informed by the same question. It occurred to me at that time, like 20, it occurred to me that religion somehow has to do with these big questions, and I want to find out how it is for different religions, how they relate to them, articulate them. And philosophy seemed like the ideal field to study, the things that I was interested in. Now, philosophy was the most boring at first. I felt like, I study some form of administrative history of the mind. It felt very bureaucratic. It felt very linguistic. So I dropped out after one semester. Comparative history of religion had interesting elements, but it was incredibly sociological. Just what's the functional social role of religion in this society or in that society? And I could not relate well to this. And anthropology really, really captured my imagination anyhow. So at that time, it was really easy in Germany to meander. So, I enrolled in art history and spent most of my time there. And then I took a class with somebody called Rüdiger Bubner, who was a philosophy professor. And it was a history of the concept of aesthetics and how aesthetics didn't exist before the 18th century. And I was like, oh my God, hold on. Concepts didn't exist, which means people did not have the vocabulary available to think in those terms and relate to themselves in those terms. And they had other concepts that maybe made them experience the world completely differently. And that changed everything. That's then how I more or less studied ethnography. That's how I studied art history. And neurobiology was truly an accident at first. I was doing a PhD in anthropology at UC Berkeley, and I had to find a field site. And I had studied Russian and prepared to live in Russia and went to Russia for the nth time and decided, no, I'm not going to live here. No. And so I applied for a grant, got a grant to go to France, was in Paris, couldn't find a field site till my supervisor got so upset with me that he introduced me to someone and said, this is your field site and you stay here. And it happened to be a neurobiology lab, and the man, Alain Prochian, my supervisor was someone called Paul Rabineau. Man, I dearly loved. He died recently. And Alain Prochian in France said, okay, you can do your research here, but you have to study neurobiology and get a degree, at least a 1-year degree. And I'm like, no. I have zero interest in the brain. You can forget that. No, I'm a philosopher, concepts and so on. And well, I enrolled in neurobiology and studied neurobiology. And that was another moment where everything changed. I became a brain. I learned what it is to be cellular. Still from a conceptual perspective very much. People didn't always have brains. People were not always composed of cells, so to speak, in their own self-comprehension and knowledge. And so I learned that neurobiology, if anything, is on an experimental level very much a conceptual and philosophical field. And Prochian one day came to the lab, maybe 8:30 in the morning, and he said, hey, you. And he looked at me and everybody else looked at me and he said, you're stupid. And he walked away. He was very provocative. And of course I was embarrassed. Everybody laughed and I ran after him and was like, you can't say this in front of everybody. And he said, why can't I? You're stupid. And so I'm saying it. And he walked away. And so a couple of days later we met and I asked, so why you think I'm stupid? And he said, well, because you think that biology or science is about the discovery of truth. And you don't like that, and so you favor philosophy. And I said, well, please explain to me what science is if it's not like discovering truths. And he said, yeah, you don't understand. That's why I called you stupid. So let me explain to you. The task of science is to increase the possibility of truth. Do you really think that science discovers the truth one building block at a time and then builds the house of truth? That would be a prison. And by the way, it's just simply not true, as you well know. And I asked him to tell me more, and that lab was working on brain plasticity. And Alain had more or less, in the late 1980s, done a survey of everything that was happening in neurobiology at the time, and he found that everybody assumes one thing to be true, and that is that an adult human brain is a fixed and immutable cellular structure. That's the only reason why everybody focuses on the molecular chemistry of synaptic communication. And he had trained as a developmental neurobiologist, as somebody who studies the development of the brain during embryogenesis. And he decided that can't be. There is no organ in the human body that does not regenerate on some level, that there must be new cells, there must be continuous growth. It's utterly implausible that this would not be the case. When he gave the first talks about this, he was ridiculed, laughed at. People begged him to stop saying nonsense. And at the time I entered the lab, they just succeeded with other labs to discover that many thousand of new nerve cells are born in adult human brain every day. But for him, that was not about the discovery of the truth. It was creating experimentally a conceptual possibility for thinking about the brain differently. So for him, and I think that could be really an interesting segue to design, conceptual thinking and doing experiments coincided. There was no difference between philosophy and doing something. In fact, an experimental arrangement is a philosophical exercise. The second it was discovered, he had very little interest in further developing that space. He tried to sort of modulate a bit, try to find out what is conceptually possible, but then he moved on. And from a villain, he became a professor at the Collège de France, which is France's most distinguished place for being a professor. And in fact, he went on to become president of the Collège de France, which is quite a journey.
That's impressive. And so we touched on concepts a few times so far. And I want to challenge the importance of concept a little bit, just to kind of play devil's advocate and see if you can help us understand it. Things are what they are. Why are concepts matter so much? If we live in the same world that we lived before we had a certain concept, and add to that the Buddhist insight that all concepts are inherently conventional and limited. Why are they still important?
Well, let me ask you one simple question back. How do you get access to the world beyond concepts?
I guess through the senses.
What if the senses were already a concept? It may turn out to be a fairly Buddhist answer. I have no allegiance to Buddhism or to anything for that matter, but there are two different ways into this story. The first one is an episode about Socrates and Socrates of young Plato. And the second one is a comparison between Western philosophy and traditional Chinese philosophy. And I'm going for a second into, I don't know with which one to start, but let's start with it. Comparison with traditional Chinese philosophy, because you just said, well, it's the importance of concept. Things are what they are. Implicit in that sentence is actually an assumption. Things are. That is, there is an is, as if they have some ontological essence, a being. Now, it's so interesting that most languages that anthropologists have recorded and that we historically know of don't have a word We have a noun for being. How fascinating is that? And the most careful studies about this are, on the one hand, about Greeks, ancient Greek, archaic Greek, and on the other hand, about traditional Chinese philosophy. And in traditional Chinese philosophy, the word being is absent. It's not known. So things are, except they were not always. And it's interesting to mostly focus for a second on the Greeks, because the first time the noun being is articulated is in Parmenides. And he more or less says, hold on, we say the trees are over there. What means are? Like, until that point, the word being was mostly used as a copula. So he began to was the first to systematically reflect on, what do all trees are over there? What do all trees have in common? What does that mean are? What does it mean to say a tree is? Is there an essence, a being of trees that is the real thing and what we see is not actually real? So many philosophers, many historians of philosophy have articulated the idea that Plato and Aristotle are kind of a footnote to Parmenides because they systematize that philosophy of being. And we don't need to decide at all whether that's true or not. But what we can say is that without Parmenides, Plato, and Socrates or Aristotle, our Western concept of things having an essence, the distinction between thing and being, the idea that, there is a reality organized in individual ontological substances, basically, is inconceivable, and actually was inconceivable for many people for the longest time. So you go to traditional Chinese philosophy, Wu, concept in Taoism, means thing, but it's not a thing in the sense that the opposite of a thing is a being. There are only things. And what a thing is depends on the relational context it is in. Now, I just used the word is. I cannot even articulate it differently, right? We're so dependent on the term being. And so if what a thing is depends on what it is in connection with, then there is no stable thing. And you can do this for yourself. For Iran, every relation you have offers you the opportunity to be one person that most other relations you have don't offer you. So the easiest example is your parents. You only have one mom and one dad. And when you have siblings, if only in those relations can you be a brother or a sister and so on. But you can continue this to the smallest everyday encounter that you have, which also would mean that if one of your relations dies, a part of who you are dies too. And I find that very fascinating. However, the key part here is being is a concept. It's not a thing. We have no clue at all if the world is composed of beings, if there is a distinction between beings or things. And so we don't know. The importance of concepts is precisely as you say, that they're conventions, but they're powerful conventions in the sense that they organize our comprehension of self. They organize how we think and experience the world. So you can literally study the historical or the history of the structure of experience and how it changes over time. And I think that's a good segue to the second episode, which is deeply important to me in my life and how I orient. And that is Plato's first book. It's not a dialogue. It's the only one that doesn't have the apology. So Plato is very young at the time. And he writes the story of Socrates' death. But the interesting part is not at all the death. That's what everybody focuses on. It's actually something else. The interesting part of the story is Socrates and a couple of friends go, it's a pilgrimage. They go to the Oracle of Delphi. And pilgrimage at that time may not only be a reference to piety or religion. It's also a couple of young men going away, drinking. Incorrect from today's perspective, but they're temple prostitutes, and they it's almost like an initiation for them. And so they're drunk and they have a fun time, and one of Socrates' friends shouts to the oracle, "Hey, is there anybody who's smarter than Socrates?" And they all laugh. Socrates is a little embarrassed, and the oracle says, "No, Socrates is the wisest man." the party is over. It's a total shock. Socrates has anxiety attacks, runs away, doesn't know what happened to him. He feels like the burden of the cosmos is on him. And he knows that he's not smarter than anybody else. But he also knows that the oracle doesn't lie. So what's he supposed to do? So he after a long period of crisis, returns and begins talking to people who are designated as smart in Athens. And he says, hey, everybody says you're the smartest. Can you help me understand? Like, how do you think about this? And how do you know that? And then, you get into that classical Socratic method. And how do you know that? And how do you know that? Like, what it ends up with is that Socrates more or less discovers that whatever people claim to know at the end of the day depends on an assumption about the world that they cannot justify. So in a belief, he calls it a doxa or opinion. And so he concludes more or less that every knowledge, every knowledge requires a harmony of illusion where you buy into something, where you want to buy into something. And he says, I'm not wiser than everybody else, but I know that I don't know. So this space of ignorance, the primacy of ignorance, is something that he tries to establish as an accomplishment, as something that you have to work towards to be in that state. Because if you're a mere mortal, you just live in the taken for granted. If you claim to have wisdom, you're a jerk. So the in-between space where you live above the merely taken for granted or beyond, but you do not claim to have knowledge, that's the space for the philosopher. And that's the reason why Plato invented a new term called philosophy. Like, lovers of wisdom means you don't have wisdom, but you long for it, so you can no longer live in the taken for granted. So all of my work for the longest time was nothing but an effort to render visible ignorance by pointing out the concept dependency of things. But, I have to, I warn everybody who tries to do that, because Socrates didn't end well. He was put to death because if you show others that their knowledge is dependent on assumptions that they cannot justify, you may be up for trouble.
Yeah. And we'll get to some of these assumptions. But so before that, I want to talk about your time as a professor and your your early time as a professor and your unease with that. Something didn't sit well with you in that situation. I'd love to kind of see what broke there.
Yeah, it was. So one part of me wants to rush forward and say it was just a sad time. It was really a personally sad time of breaking. But another part of me wants to hold back because I met some very fine people when I was a professor, with whom I spent a lot of time and who I couldn't think more highly of. And I don't want to say it was a sad time because it would also reflect on the conversations I had with them. But basically, I grew up as a peasant boy. I went to university and discovered the beauty of thinking about thinking. And thinking about thinking simply means that you make your own thinking, the way that you think, the way that your associations travel, the object of your own reflections in order to ask, why do I think the way I think? Why do I come to judge the way I judge? Could I change this? Where do the ideas that I operate with come from? Are they actually mine? Do I want them to be mine? How else would I behave? And I had the unbelievably crazy fortune to apply to one single graduate school at Berkeley, got in, and was admitted by Paul Rabinow, who is probably the only anthropologist at that time in the world who thought that anthropology is thinking about thinking. So Paul always had only a small number of students at the time. For some time, I was his only graduate student, I guess. And he would call me at 8:30, say, hey, what are we doing today? And an hour later, we met, and we were mostly sitting in his office, walking through the Berkeley Hills, walking across campus, and talked till 5 p.m., every day. It's an unbelievable experience. He and a couple of other people, Lawrence Cohn, Irina Paperno, Sharon Kaufman, who also unfortunately just died, introduced me to ways of thinking, to asking questions that It's not that I couldn't imagine them. I couldn't even imagine that one could imagine something like that. It was completely beyond me. It was a period of extraordinary growth. Well, I applied to university for jobs and got a job and found that that's not what the university is built for. That was not at all what was at the center. I was just incredibly naive about it. The competitiveness, the administrative burden, the fact that I asked whenever I met somebody, and I still do this, what is the one assumption that this person must make in order for her or his argument to hold? And then I will point out that one assumption, that makes you extremely liked. But I was not aware of this because I completely naive, like from peasant boy to Paul Rabinow's office, like that it was the space where you could do this. So I had some colleagues like Alberto Cambrosio and most importantly Alan Young at McGill who said, no, this is not what the university is about, but you can create those spaces. You find your graduate students, you build your space, you have those conversations. But then I could not make my questions stay within the box of the disciplinary confines that were necessary to get tenure. I just had too many, and they couldn't subsume them. I got tenure, I got this William Dawson Scholarship or Chair, but I didn't want to continue. Like I was physically or I don't make a distinction between physical and psychological. I was overall unwell, like really, really unwell, and felt, okay, the people don't like me. I understand why, but I also cannot change the questions that I have to ask. I don't even, I never chose to ask them. They come and happen to me, and I'm in their service. And the university is organized in terms of 19th century disciplines. The world has radically outgrown this. I don't want to do anything within that infrastructure. I tried for a little while to convince the dean to let me build a new center at McGill. They all thought I was way too junior to warrant something like that. And then I got fellowships, mostly from the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research around Alan Bernstein, who just stepped down as president. Became a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and had some financial freedom for 1.5, 2 years if he would stretch the money. And I said bye-bye to McGill and decided to see where I would end up, which was, on the one hand, pretty insane because, as Canadian assistant professor, you make like 75,000 Canadian dollars a year. Of all places, we decided to move to the Bay Area, the cheapest place on the planet, and had no security net, kids, family. And I tried to reorient myself, meet people, see if one cannot build in between spaces. Berkeley, through complex set of interactions, made me an offer to build a new center that would systematically bring together climate change sciences, broadly speaking, electrical engineering, people from Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and some of the people of College of Letters and Arts and Science, sociology, rhetoric, anthropology, history. And working with the provost, Paul Alivisatos, a very, very fine human being, was awesome. Organizing the faculty meetings was one of the toughest challenges in my life. You really encounter, I think it was not about departmental or disciplinary politics, but there is like this idea in the human sciences that humans are more than mere nature and more than mere machines. So whenever somebody tries to explain the human in terms of nature, in form of biology or something like that, it's called reductionism. But you're explaining humans as mere machines, as industrial tools or something like that, then, a strong reaction. But the people in the electrical engineering or the Innovative Genomics Institute, like, what would we be if we're not nature? This is kind of, what are you talking about? So I had a really rough time, and after half a year, decided it's not for me. So, yeah. That was a complicated period, but it was the only way to maintain a sense of self in all of this was to leave, was to not care about security, to not care about status. I'm a professor. I'm an endowed chair. It doesn't matter. It's completely insignificant if you lose a sense of self. If you lose like this idealism that I had with Paul or Rabinow at Berkeley, or with Lawrence Cohen or Rena Paperno, Sharon Hoffman. That's what nourishes, and I did not want anything else. I was rather unemployed and poor, basically, than doing something else.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So you were lucky enough to encounter Reid Hoffman, big name in the Valley and founder of LinkedIn. And how did that go about? And then what doors did that open for you?
Yeah, I met Reid, I think, in 2015-16. We rented a small house in North Berkeley. There were neighborhood potlucks every first Sunday of the month. All the neighbors from our street would come together. And there was a man called Mike and Teresa Olsen. Mike asked me, "Hey, so you're new here. Who are you? What do you want to do with your life?" And I said, well, I'm just leaving the university. I was a professor in anthropology, philosophy, and so on. And I want to, ultimately, my ideal dream would be to be able to build an institute that studies how the world has outgrown the 19th century disciplines that still structure the university, and develop vocabulary for understanding this, navigating this. Basically, what new concepts are necessary to navigate the present without buying into those concepts. And he said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. You should come over for coffee." So I asked later, who's that guy? And Mike Olsen was one of the founders of a company called Cloudera, which was the first, big data company. I think they literally invented the logic of big data. Were the first to use Google file sharing and said, okay, if you can use this to index the internet, then you can also use it to index any kind of data. And Mike became a good friend and introduced me to lots of people in the Valley, from Tim O'Reilly to Mark Andreessen to Reid Hoffman. And he coached me, and he's like, okay, so if you meet Reid, what do you say to him? I said, well, I don't know, I see how the conversation goes. He's like, no, you need a slide deck. And I was like, okay, how do I do that? And he, helped me write the slide deck. And so we went there and we met and hit it off, we were scheduled to meet for 30 minutes and spent the whole morning talking. A similar level of energy and dynamic and kinds of questions. Reid had studied philosophy, very interested in conceptual questions and in newness/difference. So we began to regularly meet. And one day Reid said, "So what are we doing together?" And I said, "Well, we build an institute." And he said, "Okay, let's do it." And I drove home from Silicon Valley like flying, right? I was in that car and was incredibly happy. Well, a week later, he called and said, "Hey, so Microsoft is going to buy LinkedIn. And this is not like selling your car, this is like a big maneuver. I become part of the Microsoft board. I might move to the Northwest. And I can't do that with an institute right now, but let me introduce you to my friend Nicholas." And I said, "Who is Nicholas?" And that was Nicholas Berggruen. And I flew to LA. At that point, we had money left for 1 week. My family was not happy with me. And so I flew to LA, met Nicholas Berggruen in the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And we talked, and he asked me what I want to do. And I, laid it out. And he said, "That's what I want my institute to be about." And I said, "Okay, we have 4 days to make a decision." And he said, "Well, I have to talk to the others, so give me a bit of time. So you only have 4 days. Well, next day, Don Nakagawa called me. Another day later, I flew again to LA, and they gave me at first a fellowship for 2 years, and then after 2 years, they made me director.
So I want to move into the, I guess, the more of the content. A lot of this started for you, I think, with the term human. What have you found about the origins of this term?
Yeah.
What did it mean through history?
So at one point, I guess in 2010, I began, actually, it's not true. I take one step further back. In fall 2009, Alan Bernstein, who at that time was president of the Global HIV Vaccine Enterprise, invited me to come and visit him and his team. They were mostly funded by the Gates Foundation, which was then still a kind of newish institution. Global health was emerging. And listening to him made me sensitive to the way that he used the term humanity. They always talked about humanity and the duty for humanity. And I was kind of, touched by this, but also didn't understand how to use the term. And Steve Wakefield, who at that time was at Fred Hutchinson Institute, one day said to me, but no, you think humanity already exists. Humanity is just a sentiment that we have, but it has never existed. Humanity is something we have to bring into existence. It's like a vacuum that pulls us in the future. And I thought that was so beautiful. And so just about a week later, I was sitting at the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation and was listening to Mohsen Nagavi, former Minister of Health in Iran, explaining that there's a difference between international health and global health. And he had 2 world maps. In one world map, humanity was divided up into a family of nations, and every nation has a national population, a national society, and is responsible for that society, for that population, and its many diseases. And then he showed a second map, which was South Asia, and it was specifically part of India, part of Bangladesh, and a part of Nepal. And instead of having 3 countries, he had 1 country defined by a disease-specific population that ran diagonal to all of these national boundaries. And that was global health. And global health needs a new infrastructure. It needs a completely different approach from international humanity. New actors that can operate beyond the national boundaries or beyond the logic of the nation state. And of course, these were NGOs, and Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, built a global international market for biotechnologies, funded NGOs. And in my head, worlds were colliding. Hold on, humanity is composed of society, and the reason why a government invests in society is that it wants its national population to be healthy and fit, at least as healthy and fit as other societies surrounding it. That was like biopolitics, Foucault. Political existence and biological existence coincide. That's why government, the history of public health, all revolved around this. But here, there was no society. There was no social justice. There was no social reform. There were biological beings living in a biological world. And the way to help them, I back then called this biomodernism, because it didn't modernize society. They modernized the biological circumstances of living of people. And so that led me to the history of the term humanity that I was really curious about. So, at one point I was just like, hold on. Since when's humanity even a thing? And I vaguely remembered as a student, I read the text by Claude Lévi-Strauss called Race and History, where he said, the term humanity is quite of recent origin. For the longest time, humans didn't know that term. And I dug in, it was like a return to 18th century books, authors. And by and large, the term, it is true that the term in its modern sense didn't exist basically before the 1780s, when it first was invented in France, Humanité, then translated into, the Germans, Menschheit, picked it up and eventually is first prominent in the US, and before it was prominent in the UK, humanity. And I was fascinated by this idea that there is a sentiment that makes humans connect to one another as a single species that had not always existed.
Yeah.
It's really not easy to understand that the human is a concept, and just that, a concept. That it's a conceptualization of what humans are. There are two ways to explain this for me. One is to actually take, and that's what Claude Lévi-Strauss did in the 50s, ethnographies, and reconstruct from those ethnographies what the concept for the human is that a group has. And what he found is that there is basically no single group. So every group, he says, refers to itself as human, but not to other groups around them. No group has a general concept of the human. Instead, they describe themselves as humans, the people who live close to them as almost humans, and the people further away as animals, period, or as ghosts, as spirits, as apparitions. So that makes clear that comparing those humans and trying to wonder what the far away and the close may have in common, which inevitably means a certain decentering of oneself because one has to sort of take the others into account, was a project. It was something somebody had to take on. It was something somebody had to do. And that simply did not happen before the early 17th century in Europe. Why the early 17th century? Well, partly because, the nascent scientific revolution had began discrediting the medieval scholastic cosmos, and partly because there were more and more reports about non-European life forms arriving in Europe. So people began to ask questions. So that's one way in. And the answer that people like Descartes and Hobbes were among the very first gave was, well, there is one thing that seems to set humans apart, to define them, that is true everywhere, and that is that they have language, and language means logos, and that must mean reason, and that they invent things, and that means there is the human on the one side and nature on the other side, animals on the other side, which was basically exempting humans from the cosmos for which the divines were, for which the clerics were responsible. And so at the time, in the 1630s, it was a very clever conceptual set of operations to bring humans into their own, all humans everywhere. In the Enlightenment, you then quickly get, people with darker skin have less reason, or they may not yet be as advanced, and so colonialism and racism sneaks in. So if you take Descartes, if you take the Enlightenment, then you arrive at two really important differentiations that structure the human. One, humans are more than mere nature. They're more than animals or plants because they have reason. They're subjects in a world composed of objects. Two, humans are qualitatively different from and irreducible to machines, closed Newtonian mechanical systems. So if you take that for a second, then you have humans, nature, and machines technology. And then you take AI, you take machine learning. Let's say the distinction between humans and machines is much less clear than it was when machines were basically industrial machines, or when machines were at best, Xerox machines or refrigerators or vacuum cleaners. So there is now a set of things that makes it in principle conceivable to say humans are a version of machines among machines. There are suddenly things in the world that cannot be organized in terms of the conceptual categories that we had: human things, natural things, technical things. There are lots of things that fall in between and that we don't know how to think or relate to. So that led to the idea that biotech and technology, or AI labs, robotics labs, neurotechnology labs, are effectively philosophical laboratories. Like, they elaborate new, still experimental possibilities for being human, for living a life on the planet today, but they're not practiced in those terms. So what if we would bring philosophers and artists into those labs and just see? That was the starting point for Transformations of the Human at the Berkman Institute. And as a matter of fact, artists were not there at the beginning, but we had a couple of experiments in labs that worked better than others. What we found was that if you just put young philosophers in an AI lab, that doesn't work, because philosophers like to talk. And engineers like to do, and that's not so easy to bridge. But there was one lab in particular, Jan LeCun's lab, Facebook AI Research Lab in New York, but it was also an artist, and the artist could easily converse with the philosopher because the artist thought he's a philosopher too, but he could also easily talk to the engineers because they were both doing stuff. And so art turned out to be an incredibly powerful bridge between thinking and doing, basically.
Yeah. Art or design.
So,
I would say design is in the same category as designers.
yes,
We're constantly moving between the ideas and the code.
Completely agree. I think we sometimes make a distinction between art as research, where the goal is to produce an artwork as outcome that has a kind of philosophical agency that makes you experience the world differently, and design, which often is, even in the form of speculative design, in the service of product development. But then this powerful move comes, and that is, hold on. So if an artwork can have a philosophical agency in the sense that it produces your experience differently, there's exactly zero reason why design or product development couldn't lead to commercial products that do that. And that's at the very, very center of Tufts School. Our mission statement is, we do philosophy, like the doing is front and center. So if you go into Tufts School from day one, you have concept labs where you build concepts, conceptual insights. Yes, that's the goal, to bring those two together.
So I want to take a step back, because so you talk about where these new insights take us. They challenge or disturb our understanding of what human is, and I think that I want to take just one example, which I'm most familiar with, which is AI, and maybe look at it closer and see how it disturbs our sensibilities around what's human. So we recently, actually just a few days ago, talked to one of the founding fathers of deep learning, of neural networks and learning, James McClellan. And what's so remarkable is that he created first in a paper this vision of how a neural network could learn to identify, let's say, a word and then recognize that it is in fact that word and then connect that with meaning, and how these different layers can create meaning together and sometimes correct each other. So maybe if you say you hide half of the I in time, but the word recognizer says, I think this might be time, and then suddenly you see that I, which you weren't sure about. You didn't have enough sense information. And that creates, you read this and you start to understand humanity better. And you start looking at machines, and it's I don't think you can argue that what these deep learning algorithms are doing is not learning. They're definitely learning something, and they then know it, and often know it better than we do. And so, let's take that example. How does that trouble our sense of the human? What's the potential here? Where could we take it?
Can I ask you one question quickly? So you said then you understand humanity better, or humans better. Why?
So it helped me explain certain experiences that I've had through learning. So one of the things that emerges really beautifully from this model is the explanation of what an aha moment is. So an aha moment is when different layers in the network suddenly tell you the same message, suddenly say, yes, this is it, right? Your letter recognizer and your word recognizer and your meaning recognizer all say, this is what this is, and it fits, right, in the sentence also, the meaning of this. So there's experiential things that become more familiar through reading this, and it helps explain more of the way we self-correct. So one of the things that really struck me in that conversation is the bidirectionality. So everything in neural networks is bidirectional. If you can identify, you can also imagine. If you can look at letters and recognize a word, you can also think that a certain word might be the right word, and then that informs how you see the letters. Everything is bidirectional. So that made me kind of pause and start thinking about my own experience as a human being. Obviously, I don't have a an algorithm running a simulation of a neural network in my brain, but it didn't make sense to me because it did originate with the human neural network.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about that. So I think that this is going straight to the power of conceptual thinking. So you said it helps explain what an aha moment is. And I want to make a distinction between explanation and description for a second. It offers one description of what an aha moment is. But here is an anecdote. It's 2017, maybe 18. And I talked for the first time to someone called Ilya Sutskever at OpenAI, one of the most famous AI researchers. And it was a funny conversation because I say, "Hey, Ilya, I'm so happy to meet you." And he said, "I don't know if this makes sense." And it took me a second to sort of, what do you mean? It's like, well, you're an anthropologist, he says. And I say, yeah, and you're an engineer. And he says, exactly. Like, okay, no, you have to give me more. And he said, well, you're interested in humans. And then he recognized, yes, I'm interested in humans too. I care about them, but, I'm building machines and I care about them. And I said, me too. And that's why I, think we should talk, an anthropologist and an engineer. And he said, explain more. And I said, well, for a long time, machines were the non-human, and today, machines like the ones that you built are used to explain humans. So shouldn't we have an anthropology of machines? And from there it unfolded. But what you just described is a perfect example. Like, you look at these neural nets, and they provide a descriptive vocabulary for how we can think about ourselves, for how we then think about machines differently. And then you leave the conceptual space of the human, and you enter that space where there is no necessity to make a distinction between humans and machines in a radical qualitative sense. In fact, there is no need to make a distinction between an organism or a being on the one hand and a thing on the other hand. And that is scary if one still has the sort of Marxist concept of a machine as, stinky, loud thing with levers and gears to which you don't want to be reduced as human. But it's not scary if you allow the machine or the AI system that it has little left to do, in fact, nothing with these old style machines, and that it offers you a new vocabulary where, almost in the sense of traditional Chinese philosophy, you don't need to make a distinction between being and things anymore, and it offers a whole new experience of the world and of who you are in the world. And I think if AI engineers get to build AI machines from that perspective, how awesome would that be?
That makes me think of DALL-E. It makes me think if you've seen the OpenAI DALL-E, essentially where DALL-E 2 is incredible. You can generate art that's, you can say, I want an oil painting of a raccoon astronaut with the universe reflected in its glass helmet and looking longingly at the stars. And it paints this beautiful picture on the spot that's just as good as any artist could have made it. And you have to start asking questions about creativity, right? And, the creativity is no longer the realm of the human.
Yeah, I used DALL-E quite a bit. The last few weeks, I spent many evenings trying to understand what experience one can have with DALL-E. And I think I do not want to belittle DALL-E in any way. It's an unbelievably exciting accomplishment. I find GPT-3 much more exciting because the way in which you can engage with it. So one of the problems with DALL-E is the creativity is on your side. You imagine what you want to see, and then you give it the text prompt, then it produces it. And if I would type, as I'm CEO of Transformations of the Human due to AI and gene editing, then I get images that are very, very similar to the images I get when I type the exact same thing on Google image search. So it stays within a certain pre-established imagination, human imagination. So I wouldn't say it has imagination of its own. But when DALL-E gets interesting and good when you juxtapose categories of things that you usually do not bring together. An insect with transparent skin, no head, a kelp forest growing through it, and an AI chip implanted. And then, you have several further layers of like precise, concrete description. Then you get something that you would have never, ever expected. However, once it is done, it is done. It has the same objective output function like an industrial machine. You like click a button, it makes sounds like, and you get an output. That's it. You cannot change it. You cannot go to DALL-E and say, hey, DALL-E, you're so much more educated than me. I think I want the background blue. What do you think? And DALL-E would say, Eran, come on, give me a break. Blue. No, how about yellow? And so, there's like no, it's not optimized for process. There's no back and forth. And so the consequence is that the creativity is on my side. I can use it as a kind of kickstart, almost like a random image generator. Of course, the term random is not fair, but it is random in the sense that it's not obvious what you get. And if you then want to work with it, then you go to Photoshop. That's how most artists use it. Every machine that ever was built has an interface of sorts, an interface where you click a button. And so what's the structure of relation? Command, response, or command execution, command response. Think of Siri or Hey Google, command response. And DALL-E stays on that level. It follows the logic of the old concepts. The human is the creative and intelligent thing, and the machine is the tool that is used to further that human thing. Can one liberate DALL-E from both the concept of the human that we have here and the concept of what a machine is and make it into something itself? How cool would that be?
Yeah, I would just put it out there that, as a designer, as someone who works with illustrators, there's a lot of creativity in the selections of how, even if you have a very detailed description of what you need to draw, selecting the style, the emotion, the angle, the texture, the colors, there's a lot of creativity there. And that's that's the difference between a great illustrator and a not so great illustrator. And so I work with these people and I have a lot of respect for them. And now I can see an algorithm that does it just as well as them in many cases is mind-blowing to me, because it is part of my daily job, and I can very easily imagine a DALL-E-like algorithm that creates user interfaces, which is my job, right? And where the person can describe what the interface does in the style of the branding in words, and then bam, 100 screens, beautiful, everything is done. And so these things, the human is still the initiator, but there's whole professions of people who are very creative and have a lot of know-how that do these steps in between and are potentially about to be automated away, including myself. I'm in a place where I'm not too concerned, but there's definitely illustrators that I know that are now going to have a harder time.
Some time ago, I did a project with a Montreal-based artist called Mara Eagle. We called the project Atlas. And the project was called Atlas because of Abby Warburg's famous Atlas, where he felt he had discovered a series of visual themes across time and space that define the visual vocabulary available to the human mind, or something like that. So he tried to, show variations of this. And so what Mara did is that she would have shoot from the hip photos, walking through Montreal, and uploaded them on Google image search. And Google image search then produces similar photos. And some of the photos were visually similar, but no human would ever pick those and say they're similar. So let's say she filled a pothole in the street filled with new tar. And among the images that Google image search generated was a microscopic photography of an E. coli, a black thing on a light gray background, and was a Zeppelin, light gray background, black thing, but also absurd, crazy stuff like lips photographed really up close, led to sort of fleshy tomatoes really photographed up close, or a photo of a male nipple led to, a hurricane, like things that were crazy. So we, of course, selected for the crazy photos. And I like that because she curated the art, but the space of possibility was given by the machine, basically. So you could say that that's very similar here. And I think that DALL-E is, of course, better than Google image search and so on and so forth. But what I find is perhaps unfair, but, my experience of playing with DALL-E, at least, is that it stays, by and large, within the context of a visual vocabulary, thinking in terms of concepts, that I already know. So there is very little surprise when I go to an art museum, when I go to a gallery, when I work with artists. They are experts, most of them, not all of them, to giving you a visual experience that you did not yet have and could not yet imagine, or something like this. So there is something that is foregrounded that is not, I haven't seen from DALL-E. And I think it's logically not quite possible because it can only operate within the space of possibility of the text that is given to it, like on which it is, it's a transformer. So the transformer must have been trained before, so that's where it stays. But many designers, many artists will use tools like DALL-E as a starting point, like they play around with it till there is something that hooks them, like something that they work with, something that guides them. And that means there is, of course, a dialogue, a back and forth of sorts. And of course, machines participate in things that was inconceivable for them to participate in basically a year ago. One just has to remind oneself that how implausible something like this was. And that's extraordinary. So we can meet somewhere in the middle.
Great. So you worked with some great companies like Google and Facebook, and you worked with Stanford. I would love to hear about some of the takeaways, of some of the insights, anything that you can tell me as an example of bringing this philosophical mindset into these engineering rooms and bringing the human into these rooms. And I would love to make it concrete.
Yeah, this is actually not so easy because most of these projects I cannot talk much. But at one point we began to work with a robotics company as part of Google X, the Moonshot Factory. And their plan was to build everyday robots with a physical intelligence. And I really love that phrase, artificial physical intelligence, which unfortunately, the acronym is API, and that's already taken. But artificial physical intelligence. And the whole idea was building machines in terms of biology, almost as if there were organisms among organisms, and to blur that distinction. And I really like that idea a lot. So simultaneously, I was involved in a series of incredibly nourishing conversation with an artist called Annika Yi. Annika did do shows like one in Venice called Biology of Machine, and then we worked together on it's the early days of her Turbine Hall show. It was called In Love with the World, and was about robots that fly and are kind of physically intelligent. And bringing Annika to Google X, engineers who've never had any particular interest in art recognize this artist is asking questions that are exactly at the core of what I'm asking. And it was a quite extraordinary experience, I think, for everybody involved to see that this having a set of more or less conceptual / philosophical questions and being concerned with how to be able to build a material thing that either transports these questions or can only be built if you think through these questions, in order to then have something that literally can make you live differently, experience the world differently, that there was a continuum, that this undifferentiation of philosophy, art, and technology into a single practice was something that we could bring together. So that was very powerful. And there is a second aspect there, that is when we began working with the engineers, we found that they had actually a bunch of classical industrial roboticists, like building a robot arm with like 7 degrees of freedom. And they had a bunch of machine learning engineers. And that was somehow supposed to lead to physical intelligence. But what they really did was using the industrial robot paradigm, and that is based on, it's fully programmed. It has to be fully programmed. Like the sensors of the robot arm are used to exactly define, to exactly know at any point in time. It's like calibrated like a thermostat, and then you know at which place in Cartesian space a robot arm is. So these sensors are not used for input, but in order to control. And of course, like a control software paradigm does not lead very far if you want to operate in everyday environments. So that was where machine learning came in. But that didn't work because the space of possibility was so small, the sample data was so small that, like it had to be explainable in order to make it fuse with the robot, with the control software. So there was also animosity between the hardware engineers telling the machine learning engineers that they're idiots because they don't know, basic physics, and the machine learning engineers were tired of being second rate, always thought that they can just not think in the abstract. So we spend a lot of time asking, okay, the concepts that you operate with that organize your worlds clearly don't work. You have to optimize the robot body for machine learning. However, you have to optimize machine learning for the robot body. How do you do this? Who has to work with whom? And we worked out a whole series of new experiments and workflow, and always guided by the idea that we want to build a robot that has nothing left to do with classical robotics, that is not about automating work, that is not about a factory hall. And then you get into areas that are quite unbelievable, like, robot security, safety is an industry paradigm. Well, how do you translate this for something that is not a caged machine, that is actually maybe operating in your home, that you may live with, that might be a kind of companion? So then you have to go with the engineers and the people who built the new safety paradigm into the history of the concept of safety. We went into the history of the concept of robot, which was the term for the labor that the serf owed the landlord, robot. And that in turn was like derived from the Aristotelian word for slave, doulos. And that's indeed how we built machines for the longest time. So they did not want to do that. So how do you change this? And we developed concepts together. So that's one way in to explain how the philosophical and artistic work that we bring to a company matters.
Wonderful. So I have one final question that people are expecting. You can keep it as short as you like. But in his TED Talk, Alain de Botton, the philosopher, talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being this modern informational, dry way of conveying information, and a sermon being an urgent plea to change someone's life. And he kind of longs for the days of sermons. He thinks we need more sermons today. So if you had a chance to give a short sermon, what would it be?
So I want to introduce a third option. It's a conversation or a dialogue. And the one question that comes in two flavors that I like to ask people at a more advanced stage of a dialogue is, what's the one ontological residue that you take to be true, even though it's probably just a conceptual convention? And the second flavor in which this comes is, what do you do when you arrive at an insight, call it an intellectual insight, that one of your most fundamental values is not tenable? These are both versions of what do you do when you need to ask yourself, can I think differently from how I think? So this is something that I'm concerned with.
All right. Thank you very much, Tobias. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you for leading me into this conversation and through the journey that this was. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me, Ron.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well everyone, and see you next week on Remake.